Today's lecture is going to be focusing on population ecology and the factors that may affect it, okay? So we are looking at populations in relation to their environment. So just as kind of a reminder, right, large would be like the biosphere, like all of Earth, and then biome, you all are familiar with biomes now. And then an ecosystem, right, you all have to pick an ecosystem within your biome. And then even within that, there's a community, which is a whole bunch of, it's a little bit more zoomed in, right? And then even more zoomed in than that is a population, okay? So just like put this in your mind of like how zoomed in we are, okay? And we're looking at how different factors can influence like the size and where they are and different age structures and things like that. We're going to get into all of these things. Let's be really clear about what a population is, okay? A population is a group of individuals of a single species. Okay, so let's go back here. Notice here, maybe that's what? Deer or elk or something, right? So just one species, not multiple species. Like that's the difference between a population and a community. Community is multiple species. Population is just one species, okay? So it's a group of individuals of a single species living in the same general area, okay? They're going to rely on the same resources. They're going to have the same like weather and all of that stuff, okay? So they're probably going to be breeding and reproducing with each other. All right, so let's take a look at some of these factors. One important factor would be density. So it's not just how many, it's how many per unit area. Both of these have 20 individuals, but if you see the difference in the size here, obviously these ones are more closely packed together. So this is always given to us in individuals per like area or maybe volume. And it changes all the time, right? And so some examples, like for people in Madison, there's about 3,037 people per square mile. So if you take a mile, a square, that is a mile on each side, okay? If you were to like be in an airplane from up above Madison and look down on a square mile, okay, 1 mile on each side of the square, there would be about a little bit over 3,000 people living in that square, okay? In Milwaukee, there is 6,214 people living in a square mile. So like double that. Okay. In Chicago, there's almost 12,000 people per square mile. So again, it's like double Milwaukee. And then in the Philippines, there is 111,000 people per square mile. Okay, this is the highest in the world, this population density. Okay, so just that's how many people would be shoved into that box. Okay. So I'm telling you that Madison's is around 3,000, but like that's not going to be constant. So what could think about in your head, like what could cause the population density to go up and what might cause it to go down? Think if you can come up with at least one idea for both of those. Got your ideas? Let me show you some that I've come up with. Things that can increase density would be, birth, babies being born are going to make our numbers go up, and immigration, aka people or animals or whatever moving into the area, right? And then things that would decrease would be death and emigration, which is people or things leaving, right? So birth and immigration would add in, and deaths and emigration would take out. Okay? So other than density isn't the only factor that affects population size. What else do we have? Well, we've got some good abiotic factors. These are not based on living things, okay? But how much sunlight? What is the temperature? How much precipitation is there? Is there water nearby? What's the soil like? What are their nutrients? These are all considered density independent because these factors aren't going to depend on how like tightly packed in individuals are in the population, okay? Like the rain is going to be what the rain is. It doesn't matter if the herd is 500 or 50 or 5. It's going to rain on them all the same amount, right? So that it's abiotic, doesn't depend on life, and it also doesn't depend on density, okay? Some of our biotic factors, these are going to depend on living things, would be things like, hey, is there enough prey around? Or are there a whole bunch of predators or parasites, or is there disease? How much competition is there? Not only are these more life-based factors, but they're going to be density dependent, right? If there's 1,000,000 mice in the square mile, it's going to be a lot easier to hunt them than if there's 10 mice in a square mile, right? So these are going to depend, they are going to be density dependent, and they're also going to be based off of living things. When we look at a population, we can talk about its size, its range, and its dispersal. Okay, the size is just simply the number of individuals. Okay, The range is where is it found. So here's a map that shows the ranges of two different kinds of gray parrots. There's the Congo gray parrot and the Timna gray parrot, okay? So the Timna is this dark red right here. We're told that the size is, well, that's pretty big estimated population, huh? Sizes, I don't know, anywhere between 120 and 260,000, okay? And here's their range found in these parts of these countries, okay? And then for the Congo gray parrot, again, the population could be anywhere from 500,000 up to 12.7 million. That's quite a range of numbers at least, but the actual range of where it lives is all this part in the lighter red, okay? So these parts of these countries would be their range. So the size is just how many. The range is literally where do they live. And then as far as dispersal, with dispersal, this is like how are they spaced within this range? Okay, within this part, are they all in one section? Are they evenly spaced out, or what does it look like? So there's 3 different dispersal patterns that we see. One is clumped, one is uniform, and one is random. So we're going to talk about all 3 of those. Clumped is the most common. Okay, we're seeing this up top. Clumped is any animal that forms a herd or like a school or a flock, right? That's going to be clumped pattern. And animals often do this for protection, right? If you're in a herd, it's going to be harder to be picked out as an individual by like a predator. Or maybe they're all working together to do a thing. Maybe there's a certain resource that they all need access to, so they're all going to live close to that resource. So we see lots of animals living in clumped situations. Uniform is when individuals are pretty evenly spaced out. And you find this typically when it comes to things like territories. If they have certain nesting sites or territories that they like mark off, this is where you see individuals spread out just far enough so you're not in someone else's territory, but like, you know, you want to be close together because maybe, you know, like these birds, okay, you're close to this water source, but each one wants to build its own nest in a certain area. You see these sometimes, again, usually just in territorial things, and that's the only time you typically see that for nesting or territories, things like that. The last type would be random. This is the least common, and this is basically just like, oh, there's no pattern whatsoever. And oftentimes we see this sometimes with plants that are literally their seeds are dispersed by like blowing in the wind. Like blowing in the wind. And so like here's some random, right? They're clumped over here, they're spread out over here. There's like no rhyme or reason to it. That's because that's how like the seeds were distributed by the wind. Okay. Now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about one of the things back from earlier was that we were going to look at biotic and abiotic factors. Okay, we did that. That can influence the density, distribution, and size. Okay, we've covered those things, but now we're going to look at age structure of populations. Okay, so we refer to this as demography, looking at the statistics, the vitals, and how they change over time. So we're looking at like how many people are there, how often are things being born. I say people, but this could be any animal or plant. Okay, what's the rate that things are being born at? What's the rate that things are dying at? Okay. We've got a couple different age structures that we see. We can see this age structure right here is rapid growth, where you have lots of young people in your population and fewer older people in your population. And here are some examples of countries that are following this rapid growth structure. There's slow growth, where you've got more young people than old people, but the difference isn't so stark. Okay, and here's some countries. US is in the slow growth model. And then the zero growth model is essentially that you have the same amount of old people as you have young people, which means, right, roughly for every person that dies, there's going to be one born, so you're not going to have any growth there. Okay, and here are some countries that are in this type of growth model. Okay, let's take a look here at some data. We have, this is for Belding's ground squirrels, right? Here's the age over here on the left. Here's the females, here's the males. Here's the, no, I want you to focus at the number alive at the start of the year. So they started with 337 females and 349 males. And if you look after 10 years, there's one of those initial females left. Let's look at the males. Start with 349. Oh, whoa, wait. 6 to 7. There were none left at 6 to 7 after 6 to 7 years. Where'd all the males go? What? So as it turns out, you might know this, but like Males typically die earlier than females. Not always, but typically. And this goes in the animal kingdom as well as humans. Studies have found that males are more. There are certain in humans. There are certainly some health things that sometimes affect males more often than females, but also males are more likely to do risky behavior, and this is in animals and humans. And so this is why, I don't know if you know this, but teenage boys are typically charged more for car insurance than teenage girls because they're more likely to get into an accident. It just is what it is. Okay. So if we look here, here are our squirrels. Here's the females. Here's the males, showing how they reduce. So if we're looking at how often or how quickly things die off, we've got 3 different types of, these are called like survivorship curves, okay? Type 1 is going to be for like humans and many large mammals where we have most of our young living, most of the adults living, and then as we get old, we see like this huge drop off where all of a sudden, you know, people start dying past a certain age, right? But when people are young, things are pretty constant. And this goes for lots of large mammals too, like elephants and things like that. A type 2 curve is going to be much kind of, it's pretty linear, right? You're going to have the same amount of individuals dying regardless of their age. So this is often things like birds, clearly, squirrels, other rodents, some lizards, some plants just kind of die off like this. For type 3, lots of plants, especially trees, do this. There's lots of baby trees, but very few actually grow into adult trees. Oysters do this too. Tons of babies, very few make it. And also you should know that sometimes they can kind of be a blend. So actually birds have a really high mortality rate amongst their young, but a really low mortality rate amongst adults. So it's kind of birds are actually kind of a mix of 2 and 3. These are some general patterns that we see some things following. So as we look at growth, we see what's called the exponential growth or exponential growth model. And so this means that we just essentially see exponential or unlimited growth in a population. And the only way that this can happen is if the individuals have access to abundant food, they can reproduce as much as they want, and there's little to no predation. And so you might think, well, where is this even possible, right? And so one example would be the elephants in Kruger National Park. They had been hunted almost to extinction, but then they established this park around them and they got protected from hunting. And so there's all this land with no predators. And so then they were just able to explode in their population. But like their population was so low because we'd almost hunted them to extinction, right? Another place we see this type of growth is with introduced species. You might have heard them as invasive species, or the kind of the better term is introduced species or non-native species because they didn't invade. Okay, typically humans brought them there. So basically it's a species that didn't start there, but now is there again because humans brought them there either on purpose or accidentally. And they end up outcompeting the native species because they have no natural predators there. There's no diseases, no parasites there. So the usual controls that keep things in check don't keep those new species in check. So they're going to take over the area and is going to actually reduce the diversity in this area. There's a whole bunch of examples on non-native species. You might have heard of garlic mustard. That's a big one that's happening in Madison. But some that we'll just talk about, one of the zebra mussels that are now in the Great Lakes. And you know, here's where they were in 1990, here's where they were in 2000, and I'm sure they're even more now. And they can grow so much that like this was a shopping cart submerged in a lake and they pulled it out, it was covered with zebra mussels, right? So this is going to push out other animals that typically would normally live there. So it's going to reduce our diversity and might cause economic damage because things like water intake pipes and things like that can get clogged up with the zebra mussels. Yikes. Another example here would be purple loosestrife. I mean, it's a pretty purple flower, right? But in 1968, there was none of it. And then look, in 10 years, whoa, right? So now it's taken over, which you might think, well, who cares? It's a pretty purple flower. But all the native plants that typically live there have been pushed out, and now it's this purple loosestrife. So that's going to affect the animals that live there, right? Because if the animals were used to eating these plants, they might not eat this loosestrife. Okay, so those non-native species can oftentimes experience exponential growth. But clearly this can't go on forever, okay? There's not always going to be unlimited resources, and there's not always going to be just no predators. So basically, as the population gets bigger and bigger, our density is going to increase, and they're going to have like less access and fewer resources. And there's going to eventually be a limit on how many individuals that can live there. This limit is called the carrying capacity, and we represent this with the letter K. And that's the maximum population size that an environment can possibly sustain. Okay, more on that in a sec. The other type of growth other than exponential is called the logistic growth model. And this means that things continue to grow, reproduce, and growth stops once the carrying capacity is reached. So here's a couple different graphs showing just a couple different carrying capacities. So like for the paramecium right here, what's the carrying capacity? That would be where it levels off up here. So if our y-axis is in paramecium per milliliters, this would be roughly 900 per milliliter would be the carrying capacity. For Daphnia, this would be somewhere, I don't know, 135 or something. That would be the carrying capacity. For these male sea fur seals, that would be somewhere up here, somewhere above 9, but this is in thousands, so I don't know, 9,500 male fur seals. Okay, so again, where it levels off is going to be that carrying capacity, the maximum that habitat can possibly sustain. But one thing is that although these look all constant, if you really zoom in on the data, they're not perfectly constant, right? We're going to see these up, downs, up, downs, up, downs. And we can kind of sort of take an average to figure out roughly where the carrying capacity is. But there's going to be some fluctuations year to year, and it can change. Also, sometimes, depending on what happens there, it can literally change for good. So like if the deer population gets too big, they can end up eating down the trees so much that too many trees get eaten down to the point where now they don't have enough habitat. So now it can actually sustain fewer deer. Does that make sense? So like this number can change. And then if there's fewer deer for years and years and years, then maybe the tree population will go back up, and then maybe it can possibly sustain more deer. So this K might go back up, but it would take a long time, right? So one thing is that as we learned with evolution, it's all about surviving and reproducing. But reproduction is costly, okay? It requires a lot of energy, right? And if you're putting all that energy into reproducing, you might not live as long. And so when we're looking at things and how they live and how they reproduce, you need to think about like, how old do they have to be before they first reproduce? Like, are they very attentive parents, or do they just lay their eggs and leave, and how many times are they going to be able to have a baby? Do they have them once a year? Is it only a couple in their lifetime? I don't know. But basically, there's going to be some kind of balance here that natural selection is going to favor. A balance of we want to survive, but we also want to pass on our genes as much as we can, but not if it's going to kill us. Okay. So there is two different kinds of selection related to this. K selection, basically, this is going to be larger organisms where like they're putting a lot of energy into making their babies, right? Like elephants are born huge and they're like fully formed elephants, okay? And they like the mothers tend to the elephants and all kinds of things. So they're not going to have very many babies. They're going to be a little bit older when they have babies, but they're going to live a super long time. So they're going to follow that type 1 or type 2 survivalship pattern right here, okay? So they're going to fall into like one of these categories, these longer living, fewer reproductive cycle animals. Our selection, though, is going to be much more kind of out of control growth type thing. Okay, they're going to be small. They don't put a lot of energy into making their young. They don't do lots of parenting. There's going to be lots of lots of offspring. They're not going to live very long. And this is going to be our type 3 pattern where, most of the babies are going to die here. Okay. And the reason why it's called R selection is because R is like per capita increase. So our selection maximizes that, like, oh, we're going to get lots. We're going to get lots really, really fast. Okay. This can happen sometimes in areas that were recently disturbed, like flooded, burned, or abandoned in those habitats. Okay. So there's going to be like a wide open space for them to move into. So let's think about humans for a second. What type of growth are humans having? Is it exponential? I don't know. What's the carrying capacity of Earth? Are we going to reach that carrying capacity pretty soon? Is this going to level off? Are we going to keep seeing Earth's population of humans going up, 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 up? Nobody really knows, right? One interesting thing to see is the difference between how much the population is growing in developed countries versus developing countries. And it just goes to show what a difference education has with fertility rates, right? Because if you educate people on how pregnancy happens and how to avoid pregnancy, then they will typically have fewer children than if you don't, right? Also, if you're educated, oftentimes that means that you're working or doing certain types of jobs and you don't need lots of children because, you know, back in the day when we were mostly farmers, like you needed lots of children to work those fields. But like, I don't know, if your dad's a lawyer, he doesn't need lots of children to like work the law books, right? So in some developing countries, they just need more babies to help literally sustain the family by like doing the work. And then one last thing that I just think is interesting is, you know, our population is growing, and also, you know, we're leaving behind this huge ecological footprint as far as like carbon emissions. And, you know, most of the developing countries are the ones doing the most polluting. And even amongst like, look, India is very, very populated, okay? But look at how small their ecological footprint is compared to the US, right? So over here, this graph is talking about your ecological footprint versus like your capacity. So basically you want to be like operating below your capacity. So right here on the line is like you're at a perfect average. So being above the line is bad because you're kind of like, your footprint is bigger than what you have land-wise. And in the blues, like this is better because like their footprints are lower than what they have land-wise. Right now, as the whole world, we're a little bit above what we can sustain. So if we don't make some changes, like we learned about possibly in, you know, the climate change lecture, things could take a certain turn. Okay, here's where we are in the textbook, these sections. Here are some things to consider. One note is this very last one about applying the population growth equations. We're going to do that together in class. So that one's yet to come.